Hello and welcome to our webinar with Dr. David Johnson. David is a lecturer in entrepreneurship at the Adam Smith Business School at the University of Glasgow. David's research explores entrepreneurial ecosystems, science-based entrepreneurship, technology transfer and academic entrepreneurs. David has had a varied career and has a previous experience within the biopharmaceutical sector, with a number of different roles, including commercial and strategy roles. But I would like to ask David, how do you think your parents would describe what you do for a living?
That's a great question. So my parents would describe me as a lecturer in entrepreneurship, which is obviously correct. But I think if I was to ask them what I do on a day-to-day basis, I suspect they would probably say that I kind of teach students the skills and knowledge of how to start businesses, which is partly true. I am a lecturer in entrepreneurship, as you've already stated. My kind of time on a day-to-day basis is split between teaching and research. From a teaching perspective, I would actually say that I'm really trying to get students to understand and learn the processes of how to identify, evaluate and exploit opportunities, particularly with how we do that in terms of creating value in small and large firms. So I think when we talk about entrepreneurship, we always immediately think about startups, but actually we're also talking about, how do individuals create opportunities in larger firms as well. So intrapreneurship, for example.
Oh, so as you know, Abacus is all about entrepreneurship. Could you give us a quick, a whistle-stop tour of what entrepreneurship means to you and why you think it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to be fair, I think when we talk about entrepreneurship, as I said, we always seem to think about startups, but more often than not, as we as students that we're teaching and as individuals, most of those students will not go into working within a startup. They will go into working within larger organizations, be it in the public sector and the private sector. So I think when we talk about intrapreneurship, it really is very similar to entrepreneurship, that we're thinking about how do these individuals identify some type of opportunities, create some type of idea, how they then try and evaluate that, obviously within a large corporate context, for example, and then how they're trying to exploit that particular opportunity. And it's all about creating some form of value. And I think with intrapreneurship, that's really important, because what we find in these larger organizations, that's necessary to drive innovation.
Okay, and do you feel like, so obviously, as I said, you've had a very varied, career. Do you feel like you potentially were a type of intrapreneur within organisations that you've previously worked in? And if so, what do you feel like that added, both for you and for the organisations for whom you worked?
Sure, that's a great question, and I've actually been fortunate to actually work at two extremes in industry. So I started my career working, as you've said, in the biopharmaceutical industry, and I spent 10 years in that industry essentially. I started that working in large pharmaceutical companies, so huge, big multinational corporates, predominantly working at that point in kind of sales, business development. And I would say to some extent, the level of entrepreneurship in those organizations is somewhat restricted, particularly as you go in as an entry level and then build your way up. It obviously gets more opportunities. But I would say in the large organizations I've worked in, it's all about really thinking about identifying particular opportunities, and also then capitalizing on those opportunities. And I think you can do that, in a very project kind of level. So obviously part of my role was working on individual projects with companies, with universities. So I think, yes, in a large setting, you can have that experience, and it's very important to have those entrepreneurial skills and entrepreneurial skills. Kind of towards the end of my kind of industry career, I actually was fortunate to join a startup at founding. So this was a startup strategy consultancy organization working with small to medium-sized biopharmaceutical companies, and we essentially helped them with commercialization decision making. So that was actually really useful, because in that organization, I was doing precisely what it is that I'm kind of talking about with my students, this entrepreneurship. But also what we're trying to do is, with working within the startup, going through these entrepreneurial processes myself in the startup, we was actually working with small to medium-sized companies and helping them through their entrepreneurial journey and helping those individuals in that firm think entrepreneurial as well.
Okay, so kind of you've almost done the entire spectrum of entrepreneurial activity that is potentially possible. Do you feel like that over the course of your kind of industry career that you developed relationships and partnerships that have been useful to you in your academic career, and do you feel like your industry career really informs your academic practice? How do you feel like that relationship, both internal and external, works for you?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. I think I'll kind of start with the second part. So I think certainly my industry career has really informed my academic practice, both from a teaching perspective, but also then from an actual research perspective. I think if we kind of start with the research perspective, well, I spent 10 years working in pharmaceuticals. All my research now really focuses on life science commercialization, life science business models, and particularly an area of research called academic entrepreneurship. And in particular, how do academic scientists, academic entrepreneurs, essentially take innovations from the university setting and commercialize those innovations. And at the same time, how do they engage commercially at this, what I call this university industry boundary? Ultimately, what I'm trying to understand is, how do individuals do that? How do organizations in that space, such as tech transfer offices, for example, help with that process? Why are some individuals and universities better than others at doing that? And how do we generate what I call this university-centered entrepreneurial ecosystem? So my industry experience kind of really led to that kind of focus on that research. I think from a research perspective as well, my industry experience really helped me with that impact kind of factor. And I think that's really important. I think as academics, as researchers, we sometimes forget about the relevance of our research beyond theoretical contributions. And I think my time in industry prior to going into academia has really helped me think about, when I do a piece of research, a project, what are the implications for practitioners? How will that benefit industry? What are the kind of, these kind of wider implications to society? And a lot of my research projects actually sometimes start with that in mind, rather than starting with a theoretical angle. So I would say yes, from a research perspective, my industry has really helped inform that. Teaching wise, I think it really has allowed me to link that theory that I'm talking about with students, so entrepreneurial theories, etc., concepts, tools, with practice. And I think that's a really valuable kind of tool to be able to do. A lot of my industry experience features in my lectures, so I use them as kind of case studies, as examples. So if you ask my students, you'll see that they'll talk about, a lot of my examples include life science kind of examples, pharmaceutical company examples, etc. And also from a teaching perspective, it also has given me, and kind of leads to your next question, a really good network of industry individuals who I can rely upon for guest lectures. And I recently had a chap that I had known from my early days in industry come and give a guest lecture to an entrepreneurship venture creation class that I run. And to kind of then go back to that first question, as in terms of network. So I think throughout my 10 years in industry, I've built a kind of solid network around that kind of life science biopharmaceutical industry. But I've been fortunate enough to be able to do that not only in the UK, but also in the US and in Russia as well. So I think it's kind of given me a very good network, particularly to obviously be able to help inform teaching, guest lectures, to kind of keep in contact still as an academic with practice. But also I think as well, it's given me a good access to data. I'm actually quite fortunate in that from a research perspective. I'm managing to get some really good kind of access to data from some of these individuals who now are at senior level positions in industry.
Great. And you mentioned that you worked a little bit in the US and in Russia, as well as the United Kingdom. Can you tell us a little bit about differences that you think really show when you look at those. Those are three very different contexts, particularly in terms of entrepreneurial activity, academic activity, the intermeshing between the two. What do you feel like? Yeah, what do you think are the kind of highlights of that? Do you reckon?
Sure, yeah, and I think to some extent this is context specific, and some of my research has kind of tried to tease out some of those differences from an academic entrepreneurship perspective, particularly looking at why are some universities, why are some regions much better at this kind of university industry engagement, commercialization, etc., etc. I think what we find is that a lot of this work obviously is context specific. You can't replicate, what might work well in one particular region in the US can just be transplanted and taken to, some region in the UK. That's kind of just a take, and it doesn't happen like that. I think what we find, or what I see in the US from both working from my industry experience and research, is that there is this more emphasis in certainly in the areas that I've been working in this academic and industry engagement, this kind of entrepreneurial kind of activity at the university industry boundary. And I think part of that is to do with an academic scientist mindset. I also think part of it as well is to do with how you incentivize some of these kind of transactions to take place. Mm-hmm. And I think in the UK, yes, we see that in pockets, in regions, but I do think that even though we see this shift now, this rise to this entrepreneurial university, there is lots of kind of issues with kind of how we incentivize academics to do that, and in terms of how we try and give academics the time to do that as well. And kind of a lot of my research has kind of looked at how does individual scientists, again, I've talked about the life science sector I focus on, how do they manage that kind of conflict of teaching, research, grant income, etc., with trying to engage with industry as well?
Okay. And I suppose one of my interests is around in your kind of wish list. If I could take away all barriers, so COVID, if I could take away financial constraints, time constraints, all of those kind of potential barriers, what project do you reckon you would do? Where do you reckon you would do it? So kind of geographically, where do you reckon you would do it? And do you want to be known by that project only?
Sure, that's a great question. So I'm going to slightly cheat and give you two answers here, but they are related. So I think, first of all, so part of my role at the Adam Smith Business School is also being a liaison to the College of MBLS, essentially. And what I'm trying to do is really try and embed entrepreneurship across colleges. Take it out with just the business school. And I mean, one of my passions, as you know, is kind of life science entrepreneurship, academic entrepreneurship. And I would really like to get involved in a project, get key stakeholders involved, and bought into this idea of let's try and formalize some of these STEM programs in terms of having an entrepreneurship element in there, or some type of business management element in there. Because I think as students, as kind of early career researchers think about going into industry, those skill sets are really, really important. And I think it's really, really important that we try and think about embedding those into wider programs, wider colleges. So yes, so one of my projects would really be to develop a kind of entrepreneurship business management type program or course, and embed it into some of those kind of life sciences, or to some extent take it across colleges. So that would be one project. I think linked to that is this academic entrepreneurship notion, and this how do we improve academic engagement in commercialization activities, particularly given that we know the benefits of this kind of academics working with industry and vice versa. The literature in this field, in academic entrepreneurship field, is relatively young. It's not that young, but it is relatively young. And typically what most of the projects are focused on is a single setting, and particularly a single setting in the UK or the US. And has mainly taken factors such as looking at it from an organizational perspective, looking at it from TTOs and how many spin-outs TTOs generate. Kind of generalization, but that's tend to what most of the kind of research is focused on. I think what's missing and what I would like to do with a project which brings in this kind of taking entrepreneurship to the masses, out with the college, to the colleges, is really thinking about linking some of those studies and kind of doing a cross-national study where we look at a range of universities and in research institutions in the US, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, etc. Really trying to get a better kind of understanding of this cross-national understanding of academic entrepreneurship, but at the same time trying to link some of these levels. So as my research really looks at the individual level, the individual academic entrepreneur, individual academic scientist, and the implications that their commercialization activity has on wider society. I think what we need to try and do, and some of my research is going towards this direction, is trying to link some of those levels. So we know the academic entrepreneur is influenced by, say, the tech transfer office, the university, and the policies and processes. But also, how does the individual academic entrepreneur influence the tech transfer office as well? So this kind of this bi-directional relationship. And I think ultimately what we don't have enough information on is when we have this kind of individual level and organizational level, what does that mean for society? What are the kind of impacts that this have? And I think a study which kind of brings all that together, which would be a very large study, is really, really, really valuable.
So your study would be massive then. So of all
the last part of your question, in terms of what I want to be known for, that, yes, I mean, obviously I want to be known for my research in academic entrepreneurship, life science entrepreneurship, but I'm particularly passionate about embedding this entrepreneurship and to some extent wider management. I don't want it just to be entrepreneurship, wider kind of business and management training into other colleges. And as I say, my kind of focus at the moment is to try and do that with MVLS, but I really think that there's scope to do this across colleges.
Just as a quick aside, MVLS is the College for Life Sciences, for Medicine and for Veterinary Science at the University of Glasgow. So my final question is really about what you wish the world knew about social science. So what do you wish the world knew about social science that you think they don't know?
That's a great question. Let me kind of lead this from, so having spent then 10 years working in industry, working in life sciences, pharmaceutical industry, and given that a lot of my research as well is thinking about life science commercialization, and I'm speaking to a lot of life scientists, pharmaceutical executives, venture capitalists in this field, my perception is that we think that these kind of, these natural sciences kind of disciplines, life sciences, are the ones that create this groundbreaking research. And rightly so, they do. You have scientists working in the lab on, really, really important societal discoveries. And I think that's, really important to recognize. My kind of take on what I would like individuals to know about social sciences is that social scientists as well have a really important part to play in that discovery and in terms of adding value to society. And I think a really good example here, and again, it's from my experience working in life sciences, is if we think of a scientist working in a lab on a groundbreaking discovery. Now, once we get that groundbreaking discovery, we need to somehow take that to market, to take that to the end user, take that to the patient. How do we do that? Well, we know that the life scientist to some extent is restricted in doing that alone. They maybe not have the skill sets to do that. They maybe not want to do that. And that's where I think social scientists play a huge role in that. For example, to take that innovation to market, we're going to need economists, we're going to need lawyers, we're going to need people, experts and statisticians. We're going to need a whole raft of social scientists who essentially help to realize these innovations and help those innovations have a wider impact on society. So that's what I would like kind of the wider world to know about social scientists, that we too can have groundbreaking discoveries, or at least help those groundbreaking discoveries, if we're talking about discoveries in my example in the lab, reach the full potential.
That is a fantastic place to end. Thank you so much, David, for your time, and I hope that anyone who has any questions around commercialisation or academic entrepreneurship will get in touch. Thank you again.
That's great. Thank you.